Hello there. Welcome back to A Pebble for Your Shoe. My name is Ben, and today I'm going to talk about God's mercy. God's mercy in a way that it's a little bit of a paradigm shift. I don't think most people would see it as God's mercy, but with three different examples from the scriptures, I might just um, give you a little bit of a shift of your perspective. Um, Start off with a story of a guy I met at my church. His name is Isaac, and I met him in November, and then we were in a prayer group together in the early spring. I would guess maybe February or March, and I didn't really know him very well. I knew who he was, but in this prayer group, I kind of got to see where he was at that season of his life. And he said something that stuck with me when we were talking with each other about what to pray for. And he said, "I want to hear God. I want to hear Him the way you do, and I want to feel His presence. I want to see God." That's kind of the words he used. I don't know the exact like quotes words that he used, but it was something like that. That's what stuck with me. And we prayed, and I tried to kind of counsel him, because I could feel the frustration in his voice. I could hear how desperate he was wanting to see God, and he saw something in me and some of the other people in Remnant of how we had this alignment with God. We could feel His presence. We could hear Him talk in our lives, based on just our own stories, the things that we'd shared. And he wanted that. And for some reason, he was not feeling that. He wasn't aligned with it. And yet you can tell in his voice and by the look in his eye that he was serious. He wanted that. And so at that moment, I started to think, like, man, kind of sounds like God steps back from him in a way. Kind of like the way a shepherd is stepping back behind their flock. Not that God is removing himself from him, like hiding from him, but kind of the way a shepherd does. He walks behind the flock, right? He doesn't walk in front or in the middle of the flock. Shepherds tend to walk behind so they can kind of survey the land, see what's in front of them, see where the strays are, see where the lost ones are wandering off, see where the old and the young are straying behind and kind of nudging them to move forward. That's kind of what a shepherd does. And so that's kind of what I felt God speaking to me when we were praying for him. Remind me of a few stories, but we didn't have the time to chat about it afterwards. But I definitely was praying for him. Up until this time, I'm still praying for him. Um, and so some of the things that were going on in my head, I'll share with you. And first thing was Exodus 32:7. Like I'm trying to think about the areas. I didn't have to think about it. I knew it. These are stories I've known for some time and relearned many times. And one of the stories is the story of the golden calf in the book of Exodus, or Shemot in Hebrew. And it's when Moses is up in the mountains for like 40 days and Israel is starting to worry, wondering if he's even around anymore. So they made this golden calf. And we see something really interesting about God stepping back. And you see that in 32:7, where it says, Adonai said to Moshe, Moshe is Hebrew for Moses. Adonai says to Moshe, "Go down, hurry, your people whom you brought up from the land of Egypt have become corrupt." And that's interesting because he's talking to Moses and he says, the people you brought up from Egypt, your people. So in a way, God's kind of disassociating himself or stepping back from having ownership of this people. He's passing the buck to Moses. And you have to ask the question. It poses the question, why is God stepping back from Israel? what happens when you step back? It's like you're stepping back because something's about to be destroyed, right? You don't want to be in the area of the hand grenade that's about to go off. So you step back. Um, is God really going to drop an hand grenade on Israel? Kind of. It says he's going to destroy them, right? And start over with Moses. That's kind of the proposition he's giving to Moses. It doesn't happen because we know the story, but you see God actually stepping back, right? So kind of remember that because Isaac felt like God stepped back from him. Um, so what's going on here? What does Moses mean when he wrote that God, when he employs the words that he's saying your people, the ones you brought out of Egypt? Like why is Moses saying that God is stepping back here, right? Aren't they his people too? Aren't they God's people? Isn't God the one? It says later on that God brought them out of Egypt on eagle's wings, right? With a mighty hand. So why is he separating himself? Why is he stepping back? Um, what does it mean when God steps back from his people? What does it mean when he steps back from us? Why does God have to separate himself and step back from us? Right? It's kind of like this, right? Jesus says where darkness and light can't dwell in the same place, right? That when you turn on the light, the darkness has to flee. In a way, that's kind of like God. That's an allegory of light and dark is an allegory of like God and dark and evil, or holiness and unholiness. In this category, I mean, in this circumstance, in this story, that when God's presence is around, that the holy God, when His presence is there, it you can't have unholiness in the presence of God. Unholiness has to be put aside, and just hold that thought. We're gonna circle back to this because I have another story I want to share with you, and it's the story of in Leviticus chapter 10 when the temple is built, the Mishkan. Um, they've gathered all the jewelry and all the gold and all the silver and the bronze and all the fine linen, and they've finally built the temple, the traveling temple, the Mishkan, the meeting place. Um, and they have this big celebration, and what happens? The two sons of Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, they are overexcited, and they bring us what's called a strange fire, a strange incense, into the temple where God's presence is already, the cloud has come down, and His presence is in the tent of meeting. And the two sons go in there, and they're consumed. It says that they died. And so you have an image being illustrated here by Moses when he wrote this, showing how they're bringing something that's not authorized by God, and they're just doing it on their own as they saw it good, and they were consumed. And it's as if there was this little incense which was could it have been unholy? It was not something that was set apart that God instructed to bring into the temple. And so when that entered the temple in His presence, it was just fully consumed, and they were consumed with it. Now, keep that thought in mind, and let's jump to one more story, and that's the story of Isaac, Jacob, and Abraham. These are the patriarchs of the faith. Um, and I want you to think about what God says to them. He says, walk before me, right? So if you picture that, what does it mean to walk before God? God is behind, or He steps back. And then you have the three patriarchs walking in front of Him, right? He says, I'm El Shaddai, or Kel Shaddai. You don't want to pronounce the name of God. So a lot of Jews say Kel Shaddai instead of saying the actual El Shaddai out of reverence and respect. So Kel Shaddai says to each of these patriarchs in each of their individual stories to walk before him, right? And so why are they walking before him? It's kind of in a way free will, that as a shepherd, he's behind them, he's letting them walk, and he'll just nudge them left and right and and push them along the way that they need to go. Um, so now let's come full circle. Picture this. Um, I would challenge you to think about why God steps back, and I would say that it's out of mercy. Why would I say that? He first of all, I can say from my example, about a year ago, I wasn't quite walking as well with God. I wasn't quite as aligned as I am now. And it's been a year, and I'm back in church, and I'm I grew up in church. I was a Christian probably since I was like 12 years old. I left the Catholic faith. I went to Chuck Smith. I went to one of these concerts that they used to have, and I went down at the end of the night, and I started my walk with God, um, for real. I just felt His presence, and I felt conviction through the words that were spoken. And since then, I've been growing up in youth groups, part of churches, starting churches, some mega churches, some small churches. I went through the Messianic communities with rabbis, trained with them, and that was about, I've been walking with them for 15 years in Messianic communities, and now I'm part of these home churches. But there were times where I've been up and down in my faith and not as strong. And I was like kind of in Isaac's shoes about a year before him. And I was calling out to God, and I didn't feel His presence. I felt like He had stepped away from me. I couldn't hear His word. I felt like I needed to be in His presence, like I felt it before, where I knew God had spoken to me. And this chapter of my life, I wasn't feeling it. And I'm sure that some of you guys could probably relate. And so He showed me through these stories, reminding me that, He's called me to walk before Him, giving me my freedom of choice, my free will to go to the left, go to the right, make some plans, present them before Him. And it's just that for about 2 years, two chapters, this chapter of my life that lasts about 2 years, I wasn't feeling Him walking with me. I I just wasn't in the same place I was in the past, and I was guessing. And there were some doubts in my life. I felt abandoned. I felt like a bastard in a way, kind of like Isaac. I mean, not Isaac, Isaac's brother, Ishmael, kind of like Esau. I felt like a rejected son. And those are all lies. Looking back now, I know they were. But it's just those little doubts, those little questions, questioning my identity, and that's kind of like bringing what He showed me. What I came to understand is those things were kind of, as little as they were as thoughts, they were seeds of doubt, and they were seeds of misalignment, and it's unholy. It's kind of like strange fire you're trying to enter this meeting place with God, the temple, right? Where He meets with us, which is now our hearts. And if I have those little doubts, it's like a little wick or a little kindle. And if the holy God was to enter in that presence, like with Avihu and Nadav, I brought that kind of stuff into the presence of God, it would be full consumption. It would be the little wick that ignites the fire. And so in a way, God was showing His mercy to me. That's what He kind of showed me, is He had to step back out of His love for me, right? Because if I was to enter that presence of a holy God with just the littlest wick, that's enough to be a powder keg, and my life might be consumed. So He steps back. He separates Himself. Doesn't mean that you're a bastard. It's just that He's still there. He's just behind you. You're walking before Him. He's El Shaddai or Kel Shaddai, and I'm just the sheep in front. And the interesting thing is about sheep is there's always a flock, right? And so even though the shepherd's behind, he keeps other sheep around us to kind of nudge us left, nudge us right, push us forward, keep us going. And there were sheep in my life. I had friends who were nudging me along the right way. And that's how he continues to shepherd us, even though there's little wicks in our lives that could, you know, like if he was present, like present, we would be consumed. And so he steps back. Um, so yeah, there are these little these moments, like with Moses, where God has to step back, like he did with the camp of Israel. He stepped back. He pushed Moses forward, right? He says, Moses, these are your people. He kind of disowns himself for a second, and he disowns them so that Moses, the other sheep, can nudge them the right direction, right? He doesn't want another Avihu and Nadav story. And so, yeah, in a way, that's what God was doing. He was being Kel Shaddai with me. And that's what he was kind of doing, and I'm sure in Isaac's story as well. Isaac, by the way, is really growing in his walk. He's starting to really feel the presence of God again, because there's probably some things that he got removed from his temple, things that he removed from his life, so that he could start walking with God again. So yeah, that's good news. So he, out of his mercy, steps behind us in a way to shepherd us. Sometimes we don't see him, sometimes we don't feel him, sometimes we don't hear his voice, but that's all because he's merciful. And yet he puts sheep in our lives to push us in the direction he wants us to go. So coming full circle, what did God really do when he stepped back from Israel on Mount Sinai? Was he disowning them? No. Was he would you really think God being that little that he would step back because he wants to disown them? I don't think he's that little of a God. It shows how great his mercy is. It's just that we tend to not always have the right lens to look through to see that. Could he be by chance showing mercy to Israel? Of course. Um, as you remember Aaron's sons, you see how much mercy he actually is showing to Israel. He steps back and lets Moses be the guide. So maybe what God was doing. So maybe what God was doing at Sinai on the golden calf was that he was just not trying to consume that camp like he wanted to do, or what he threatened to do, but he chose to not be present so that they would not be consumed. So now the question to ask is, how does this apply to my life, right? What's the application here? Think back to all those times where you were desperately needing and crying to God and asking for his presence, and yet you didn't feel it. Think about all those times where you might have had little wicks in your life, little doubts, little identity crisis, little shadows of questioning, grumbling, maybe? Could you say you were maybe grumbling? Or were there actually like even golden calves in your life? Idols? Idolatry, adultery kind of sounds the same. Were you committing adultery with God with something else? And so he had to step back out of mercy to protect you. Hindsight's 2020, right? Isn't that the saying? Or in this case, it's kind of like 23,000. Like you're getting a bigger paradigm now on what God's kind of doing. Like, and I chose 3,000 because of like that quote, "I love you 3,000" from Marvel's Endgame. God loves you 3,000. It's a little hindsight on your story, on your chapter, why God kind of removed his presence from you and stepped back. It's okay to wander. We wander left and right? He gives us free will. That's why he's behind us. He lets us move ahead. And his eyes are on us all the time, so that we don't wander too far. So yeah, think about all those times you felt lonely, all those times that you felt abandoned, and you weren't really abandoned, but you just felt that way. It's a feeling. It's not truth. Um, and just try and have a different paradigm shift and think about, man, if God would have been there out of his mercy, he stepped back. But because if he would have been there, maybe I would have been consumed, like Avihu and Nadav. So one last parable. I think I've come full circle. But now that we've come full circle, one last parable, one last paradigm. Compare all of this actually to a Zadok. A Zadok in Hebrew means a righteous one, the righteous one. Like Melchizedek means king of righteousness, right? Zadok is righteous, Melech is king. So he's the king of righteousness. Why was he righteous? Because he showed charity, because he gave 1/10 of what he had to Abraham. Like Tzedakah means acts of righteousness, acts of doing good. Doing everything God asks you to do includes doing acts of charity, like Melchizedek, giving to the poor, taking care of widows, right? Taking care of the orphans, visiting those in jail, like in the New Testament. That's what a Zadok does. They do everything God tells them, including charity. And who else was a Zadok? There's only two Zadoks in all the Old Testament, right? Moses and Melchizedek. I mean, Noah. Not even Moses is called a Zadok, right? It's only Noah. Noah. He was called a Zadok. Why? Because he did everything God asked him to do when he built the ark, right? Um, and so, yeah, what do we learn from Zadoks? They do everything God asks of them. Their code of conduct is based on what God tells them to do. Or you could also spin it around with this paradigm and say that Zadoks also don't do what God doesn't say to do. Or if God doesn't say it, they don't do it, right? As in the case of Nadav and Avihu, that they did something that God didn't speak of, they did it. But a Zadok wouldn't have done that, right? A Zadok doesn't only just do the things God tells them to do, but they restrain themselves from doing the things that God doesn't tell them to do, right? So that's just one other paradigm I wanted to throw at you. That's the last pebble for your shoe today. If you like this, please like and subscribe. That would help me out. And if you can comment on this, that would be even more awesome for me because then I can reply back. Anyway, thanks for joining me. Shalom.